50 years passed, and the world changed. Lisa Morgan died at the age of 74, surrounded by her students and colleagues at the Horizon Initiative headquarters. By then, the initiative had grown from a small group of dreamers into the largest scientific organization in human history. Over 200,000 researchers worked in its facilities across 6 continents. Their mission was simple: build a future that did not depend on alien charity. On the day she died, Lisa called her best student to her bedside. His name was Kevin Park, and he was 31 years old. He had spent his entire adult life working on a problem that most scientists said was impossible: faster than light travel. "Don't stop," Lisa whispered, her voice weak but clear. "Don't ever stop." Kevin held her hand and made a promise he intended to keep. The Valorian Collective had told humanity that faster-than-light travel was only possible for species that had reached a certain level of development. According to their calculations, humans would not reach that level for at least 3 more centuries. But Kevin did not believe in their calculations. He believed in human stubbornness. He worked for 20 more years. He failed more times than he could count. He watched colleagues give up and move on to easier projects. He lost funding, lost friends, and lost sleep. But he never lost faith. The breakthrough came on a cold morning in December 2097. Kevin was alone in his laboratory, running yet another simulation on his quantum fold theory. He had run thousands of simulations before, and they had all failed. But this time, something was different. The numbers aligned. The equations balanced. For one perfect moment, everything made sense. He stared at the screen for a long time, not quite believing what he was seeing. Then he picked up his phone and called his team. "Get everyone here," he said. "I think we just changed everything." The first quantum fold engine was built 3 years later. It was ugly and massive, a tangle of wires and metal that barely fit inside the testing facility. But when they turned it on, it worked. A small probe vanished from one end of the solar system and appeared at the other in less than a second. News of the breakthrough spread across the world. For the first time since the rejection, people felt something like excitement. The stars were no longer out of reach. Commander Samantha Gray was put in charge of the colony ship program. She was a practical woman with no patience for politics or ceremony. Her job was to build ships that could carry humans to distant worlds, and she intended to do it right. The first colony ships were not beautiful. They were massive industrial vessels, built for function rather than form. Each one could carry 10,000 people, along with enough supplies and equipment to build a new civilization from scratch. They had no graceful curves or gleaming surfaces. They were boxes with engines, and Samantha loved them. "We don't need to impress anyone," she told her engineers. "We just need to survive." The first ship launched in 2011. It was called the Pioneer, and it carried colonists to a planet in the Alpha Centauri system. The journey took less than a day. When the colonists stepped out onto their new world, they planted a flag with a simple message: "We are here." More ships followed. More colonies were built. Within 2 decades, humans had spread to a dozen star systems. They built cities on frozen moons and floating platforms in gas-giant atmospheres. They mined asteroids and farmed alien soil. They did all of this without any help from the collective. On Earth, society transformed in ways no one had expected. The rejection had wounded humanity, but it had also united them. Governments that had spent centuries fighting each other now worked together on massive projects. The climate was restored. Diseases were cured. Poverty became a memory. Genetic therapies extended human lifespans to 200 years or more. This was not just a scientific achievement. It was a statement. The collective had called humans short-lived, too brief to be worth their attention. Now humans would live long enough to prove them wrong. The collective watched all of this from a distance. Their observation probes, hidden in the outer reaches of the solar system, sent regular reports back to their councils. The reports noted human progress, with mild surprise. The development of fold technology was unexpected. The rapid expansion was unusual, but the collective's conclusion remained unchanged. Humans were still too chaotic, too unpredictable, too driven by emotion rather than logic. They might have advanced faster than expected, but they were still fundamentally flawed. In time, they would destroy themselves, just like every other primitive species the collective had observed. It was only a matter of waiting. But the collective did not understand something important about humans. They saw chaos as a weakness. They saw emotion as a flaw. They did not realize that these things were also strengths. Kevin Park retired at the age of 80, having lived long enough to see his invention change the course of history. On his last day at the initiative, a young researcher asked him what had kept him going through all those years of failure. Kevin thought about it for a moment. Then he smiled. "They told us we weren't good enough. They told us to wait. I wanted to prove them wrong." The young researcher nodded slowly. "And did you?" Kevin looked out the window at the night sky, full of stars that now belonged to humanity. "Not yet," he said, "but we're getting there." Samantha Gray died in 2241, at the age of 112. By then, humanity had colonized 30 star systems. Millions of people lived on worlds that had been empty rocks just decades before. Ships crossed the galaxy in hours instead of centuries. Everything the collective had said was impossible had been achieved. But the greatest test was still to come. Humanity had grown strong in the shadows, building and expanding while the collective ignored them. Soon, they would step out of those shadows and into the light. And the galaxy would never be the same. The year was 2297, and humanity had colonized 47 star systems. Captain Nathan Cole stood on the bridge of the starship Endurance and watched the stars slide past. He was 45 years old, with gray at his temples and scars on his hands from a lifetime of service. He had been exploring the outer reaches of human space for 3 years, mapping new systems and searching for suitable colony sites. It was quiet work, far from Earth and its politics. He liked it that way. His crew numbered 63 souls, each one hand-picked for their skills and their ability to handle long stretches of empty space. They had become a family of sorts, bound together by shared meals and shared dangers. Nathan trusted them with his life, and they trusted him with theirs. The mission was supposed to be simple: survey the Kepler Expanse, a region of space that no human ship had visited before. There were rumors of habitable worlds there, planets with water and oxygen and room to grow. If the rumors were true, it could open up a new chapter of human expansion. But when the Endurance dropped out of fold space near the third planet in the system, Nathan found something he had not expected. An alien station hung in orbit above the planet, a massive structure of curved metal and glowing lights. It was clearly not human. The design was too smooth, too organic, too strange. Nathan had seen pictures of Valorian technology in his history classes. This matched perfectly. His first officer, a woman named Rachel, stepped up beside him. "Sir, we have a problem." "I can see that," Nathan replied quietly. The station was sending a signal. It took the computer a few moments to translate the alien language, but when it did, the message was clear. Identify yourself or be destroyed. The Endurance was fast, and they could probably escape before the station's weapons powered up. But running would only delay the inevitable. Humanity had been expanding for decades, and sooner or later they were going to bump into the collective. It might as well be today. He opened a channel and spoke clearly. "This is Captain Nathan Cole of the Terran starship Endurance. We are explorers on a peaceful mission. We mean no harm." There was a long pause. Then a new voice came through the speakers. Translated by the computer, into flat, emotionless words. Human vessel, you are in restricted space. This region is under the protection of the Valorian Collective. Explain how you reached this location. Nathan exchanged a glance with Rachel. They don't know about the fold drive, she whispered. Of course they did not know. The Collective had dismissed humanity as primitive, too backward to develop advanced technology on their own. They had probably expected humans to still be crawling between stars in slow ships, decades away from any real expansion. The idea that humans could cross the galaxy in hours had never occurred to them. Nathan smiled slightly. We flew here, he said, in our ship. It took about 6 hours. Another pause, longer this time. When the alien voice returned, it had lost some of its calm. That is not possible. Human technology is not capable of faster-than-light travel. It is now. The conversation that followed was strange and tense. The station demanded that Nathan surrender his ship for inspection. Nathan politely refused. The station demanded to know how humans had developed fold technology. Nathan told them that humans were full of surprises. The station threatened to fire on the Endurance. Nathan pointed out that his ship was armed and his crew was trained, and that starting a war over a simple survey mission seemed like a bad idea for everyone. In the end, the station let them go. But as the Endurance folded back toward human space, Nathan knew that things had changed forever. The Collective could no longer pretend that humanity did not exist. They could no longer ignore the species they had rejected a century and a half ago. Back on Earth, Director Amy Lawson received Nathan's report with a mixture of excitement and worry. She was the head of the Terran Diplomatic Corps, a department that had been mostly theoretical until now. Humanity had not needed diplomats when there was no one to negotiate with. But now, for the first time, there was. She read the report 3 times, then called an emergency meeting of the United Earth Parliament. The news spread quickly. Humanity had made contact with the Collective again, not as beggars asking for acceptance, but as equals traveling in their own ships. People celebrated in the streets. Historians called it the most important moment since the rejection itself. But the celebration did not last long. 3 weeks after the Endurance returned home, a formal message arrived from the Valorian Collective. It was addressed to the governing authority of the human species, and written in language that managed to be both polite and threatening at the same time. The message stated that humanity's expansion into unclaimed space was a violation of galactic protocols. Humans had not been granted permission to colonize other worlds. They had not been evaluated or approved by the Collective. Therefore, all human settlements outside the Sol system were illegal and must be abandoned. Furthermore, humanity was to submit to immediate oversight by collective observers, who would determine whether humans had advanced enough to deserve limited rights. The Parliament debated for 4 hours. Some members argued for caution. The Collective was ancient and powerful, with technology that humans still did not fully understand. Starting a conflict could be disastrous. But most of the Parliament saw things differently. Humanity had spent 150 years building a future without the Collective's help. They had colonized 47 star systems. They had developed their own technology, their own culture, their own way of life. They were not going to give all of that up because some distant council decided they had not asked permission. Amy Lawson drafted the official response herself. She spent hours choosing each word carefully, making sure the message was clear but not insulting, firm but not aggressive. In the end, though, it came down to a single word. The Collective had demanded submission. Humanity's answer was simple. No. Amy sent the message and sat back in her chair. She knew what was coming. The Collective would not accept rejection. They had ruled their part of the galaxy for 50,000 years, and no one had ever told them no before. But humanity had learned something important in the years since their own rejection. Sometimes, The only way to earn respect was to demand it. War was coming, and for the first time, humanity was ready. The Valorian Collective had not fought a war in 6,000 years. They had forgotten what it meant to face an enemy that was not afraid. They had forgotten what it felt like to lose. They had grown comfortable in their power, certain that no species could ever challenge their authority. When they sent their enforcement fleet to the human colony of New Boston in the Vega system, they expected a quick surrender and a return to normal. They were wrong. Admiral Chris Lawson stood on the bridge of the Resolute and watched the collective fleet emerge from fold space. There were 24 ships, each one larger and more advanced than anything in the Terran Navy. Their hulls gleamed with strange metals. Their weapons glowed with energies that human scientists did not fully understand. By any reasonable measure, the humans were outmatched. Chris did not care about reasonable measures. He was 48 years old, the younger brother of Amy Lawson back on Earth. Unlike his sister, who fought with words and diplomacy, Chris had always preferred more direct methods. He had joined the Terran Stellar Navy at 18 and worked his way up through skill and stubbornness. Now he commanded the defense of a colony that housed 300,000 people, all of them counting on him to keep them safe. "All ships, this is the Admiral," he said calmly. "You know what's at stake. You know what they want. They came here expecting us to bow. Let's show them what humans do instead." The collective fleet moved toward the colony in a perfect formation, their ships arranged in geometric patterns that spoke of centuries of unchanged tradition. They broadcast a message demanding immediate surrender. They gave the humans 1 hour to comply. Chris gave them 30 minutes of silence. Then he gave the order to attack. The Battle of Vega began at 0900 hours, colony time. It would last for 9 hours and change the course of galactic history. The collective had superior technology, but humans had something else. Creativity, born from desperation. Terran ships did not fight the way the collective expected. They did not form neat lines or follow predictable patterns. They moved like a swarm of angry insects, darting in and out of the larger alien vessels, striking weak points and retreating before the enemy could respond. Human pilots pushed their ships beyond safe limits, trusting their reflexes and their training to keep them alive. Some ejected from their vessels seconds before impact, turning their own ships into missiles that tore through collective armor. Others flew decoy patterns that drew enemy fire away from critical targets. A few did things that seemed completely insane, and somehow worked anyway. Commander Nate Bradley led a squadron of 12 fighters directly into the heart of the collective formation. His mission was to disable the enemy flagship's communication array, cutting off their coordination. It was a suicide mission, and everyone knew it. 9 of his pilots did not come back. But the array went dark, and suddenly the collective ships were fighting alone instead of together. On the ground, the colonists of New Boston watched the battle unfold in their sky. They saw flashes of light and trails of fire. They heard distant explosions that rolled across the atmosphere like thunder. They held their children close and prayed to whatever gods they believed in. Elena Marsh was a teacher at the colony's primary school. When the attack began, she gathered her students into the underground shelter and tried to keep them calm. She read them stories and sang them songs and told them that everything would be okay. Inside, she was terrified, but she did not let it show. One of her students, a boy named Tommy, looked up at her with wide eyes. "Are the aliens going to hurt us?" Elena knelt down beside him and smiled. "No, sweetheart. Our people are up there fighting for us. They won't let anything bad happen." She hoped she was telling the truth. By hour 5, the collective fleet had lost half its ships. The survivors began to realize that something had gone terribly wrong. These humans were not supposed to be this dangerous. They were supposed to be primitive, chaotic, easy to defeat. Instead, they fought like demons, taking losses, but inflicting far more in return. The collective commander, a being named Vorax, who had never experienced defeat, made a decision that would haunt his species for generations. He ordered a retreat. Chris Lawson watched the surviving collective ships fold away into the void. His own fleet was battered. The Resolute had taken heavy damage, and several of his ships were nothing but debris drifting through space. But they had won. Against all odds, against a superior enemy, they had won. He opened a broadcast channel, knowing that the retreating ships would hear it. "Tell your councils this," he said, his voice steady despite the exhaustion. "We did not start this, but we will finish it." News of the victory spread across human space like wildfire. On Earth, people danced in the streets. On the colonies, workers stopped their shifts to celebrate. For the first time, humanity had stood against the masters of the galaxy and proven that they could not be easily conquered. But the most important reaction came not from humans or the collective. It came from other species. Across the galaxy there were dozens of races that had been rejected by the collective over the millennia. Some had been told they were too primitive. Others had been deemed too unstable, too different, too strange. All of them had accepted their fate and lived in the shadows of collective space, forgotten and ignored. Now they saw something new. They saw a species that had refused to accept rejection. They saw a people who had built their own future without permission, and they saw that it was possible to fight back. Messages began arriving at Terran embassies. They came from worlds that humans had never heard of, written in languages that took days to translate. But the meaning was clear. "We want to join you." The first alliance was formed with the Keth, a reptilian species that had been rejected 3,000 years ago for their aggressive nature. Their ambassador, a scarred warrior named Seth, traveled to Earth and knelt before the United Parliament. "We have waited for this moment," he said. "We have waited for someone to show us that the old ways are not the only ways. We pledge our ships, our soldiers, and our honor to the Terran cause." More alliances followed. The collective, which had ruled through isolation and division, suddenly found itself facing a coalition of species united by a shared history of rejection. Everything they had built over 50,000 years was beginning to crack. Chris Lawson returned to Earth as a hero. His sister Amy met him at the spaceport, tears in her eyes. "You did it," she whispered, as she hugged him. Chris shook his head. "We did it, all of us, everyone who refused to give up." He looked up at the sky, thinking of the battles yet to come. The war was not over, but for the first time, victory seemed possible. Humanity was no longer alone, and together they would finish what they had started. The year was 2347. 200 years had passed since the day humanity received its rejection. The Valorian collective no longer existed as it once had. Its rigid structure, built over 50,000 years of unchallenged rule, had crumbled like an ancient wall facing a storm it was never designed to withstand. 7 of the original 12 species had left to join the Terran Alliance. The remaining 5 had surrendered after a decade of losing battles they could not win. President Ethan Moore stood before the mirror in his quarters on Athos Prime, adjusting the collar of his formal uniform. He was 62 years old, with kind eyes and steady hands. In 1 hour he would address the First Galactic Congress, a gathering of over 60 species that had once been scattered and alone. Now they were united under a banner that no one had thought possible. His aide, a young woman named Sophie Grant, knocked softly on the door. "Sir, they're ready for you." Ethan nodded and took a deep breath. He had given hundreds of speeches in his career, but this one was different. This one would be remembered. The Congress Hall was vast, a circular chamber built specifically for this moment. Representatives from across the galaxy filled the seats, beings of every shape and size imaginable. Some had scales, some had feathers, some had no bodies at all, existing only as patterns of light. But all of them were watching, waiting to hear what the human president would say. Ethan walked to the central platform and looked out at the assembly. He saw faces filled with hope, with curiosity, with skepticism. He saw species that had been enemies only years ago, now sitting side by side. He saw the future. He spoke without notes, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber. 2 centuries ago, humanity received a message from the stars. It told us that we were not welcome. It told us that we were too violent, too chaotic, too short-lived to deserve a place among the civilized species of the galaxy. It promised that if we waited, if we changed, if we became something other than what we were, then perhaps one day we might be accepted. He paused, letting the silence settle. We rejected that promise. A murmur ran through the assembly. Ethan continued, not because we believed we were already perfect. We knew our flaws better than anyone. We knew our history of war and cruelty and selfishness. We knew that we had much to learn and far to go, but we also knew something else. We knew that growth comes from struggle, not from submission. We knew that the only way to prove our worth was to build it ourselves, not to beg for it from others. He thought of all the people who had made this moment possible. Lisa Morgan, who had founded the Horizon Initiative and refused to let humanity give up. Kevin Park, who had spent decades solving problems that everyone said were impossible. Samantha Gray, who had built the first colony ships with nothing but determination and human ingenuity. Nathan Cole, who had faced down an alien station with nothing but courage and a smile. Chris and Amy Lawson, who had led humanity through its darkest hours and its greatest victories. They were all gone now, passed into history. But their legacy lived on in every human who had ever looked at the stars and refused to be told they could not reach them. We did not wait for permission to explore the galaxy, Ethan said. We did not ask for approval to build our future. And we did not accept the lie that our nature was a flaw to be corrected. Instead, we took everything that made us human, our creativity, our stubbornness, our ability to hope even when hope seemed foolish, and we used it to forge a path that no one else had walked before. In the audience, Ambassador Kate Chen listened with tears running down her cheeks. She was the great-granddaughter of one of the first human diplomats, a woman who had spent her life dreaming of the day when humanity would take its place among the stars. Kate had grown up on stories of the rejection and the long years that followed. Now she was watching that story reach its end. Beside her sat Admiral Chris Lawson, now 89 years old and confined to a hover chair. His body was failing, but his mind was still sharp, and his eyes still held the fire that had carried him through countless battles. He had lived long enough to see the impossible become real. That was more than most people could ask for. Today, Ethan continued, we stand not as the species that was rejected, but as the founders of something new. This Congress is not a gathering of masters and servants. It is a union of equals, built on the belief that every species has value, that every voice deserves to be heard, and that the future belongs to those who have the courage to claim it. He looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of beings from worlds he had never visited, cultures he was only beginning to understand. We offer you not the promise of acceptance, because acceptance should never be conditional. We offer you partnership. We offer you respect. We offer you the chance to build something together that none of us could build alone. He stepped back from the podium and raised his hand in a gesture that had become universal across the Alliance. The Valorian Collective told us to wait 500 years. They promised that if we were patient, we might eventually be worthy. That promise never came true. Not because we failed to meet their standards, but because we refused to accept that their standards were the only ones that mattered. His voice grew stronger. We are not worthy because someone else decided we are. We are worthy because we chose to be. And today we extend that same choice to every species in this room. Join us, not because you must, but because you want to. Not because you have no other option, but because you believe as we do, that the galaxy is better when we face it together. He lowered his hand and smiled. The old order is gone. The new one begins today. Let us build it well. The chamber erupted in applause. Representatives from dozens of worlds rose to their feet, their voices joining in a chorus of languages that the translators could barely keep up with. Kate Chen hugged the delegate beside her, a Keth warrior who had once fought against humans and now called them brothers. Admiral Chris Lawson simply sat and watched, a small smile on his weathered face. Later that evening, after the ceremonies were over and the delegates had departed to their ships, Ethan Moore walked alone through the gardens of Athos Prime. The sky above was filled with stars, each one representing a world that was now part of something greater. He thought about everything humanity had sacrificed to reach this moment. The lives lost in battle, the years spent in silent labor, the dreams that had sustained them through the darkest times. It had not been easy. It had not been painful. But it had been worth it. A message appeared on his personal device. It was from Kate Chen. My great-grandmother would have been proud. Ethan smiled and looked up at the stars. The promise of acceptance had never come true. The collective had never returned to welcome humanity into their ranks. But that no longer mattered. Humanity had found something better than acceptance. They had found purpose. They had found allies. They had found themselves. And in the end, that was worth more than any promise could ever be. The message arrived on a Tuesday morning in the year 2147. It came from a place so far away that the light from its stars had been traveling for thousands of years before humans even learned to make fire. And yet, despite all that distance, despite all that time, the words were clear and cold and final. Humanity was not welcome. Daniel Carter stood alone in his office at the United Earth Council building in Geneva. He was 63 years old, and he had spent his entire adult life preparing for this moment. As Earth's ambassador to the stars, his only job had been to wait for the day when someone out there would finally answer. Now they had answered, and he wished they had stayed silent. He read the message again, hoping he had made some mistake. But there was no mistake. The Valorian Collective, a union of 12 advanced alien species that had ruled their part of the galaxy for over 50,000 years, had reviewed humanity's application for contact. They had studied human history, human science, human art, and human war, and they had decided that humans were not ready. The rejection was polite, in the way that a doctor is polite when delivering bad news. The collective acknowledged that humans had achieved much in a short time. They praised human creativity and curiosity. But they also noted that humans lived short lives, fought constant wars, and destroyed their own planet for profit. These were not the qualities of a species ready to join galactic civilization. The message ended with a promise. In 500 years, the collective would return to evaluate humanity again. If humans had changed, if they had evolved past their violent nature, then perhaps they would be welcomed. Until then, Earth was to remain isolated. 500 years. Daniel let out a long breath. He would be dead. His children would be dead. His grandchildren and their grandchildren would be dead. And still, the waiting would not be over. He had to tell the world. The broadcast went out at noon, Geneva time. Every screen on Earth carried his face. Every speaker carried his voice. He tried to be calm. He tried to be strong. But his hands shook as he read the words, and his voice cracked when he reached the part about the 500 years. The world did not take it well. In New York, people gathered in the streets and wept. In Tokyo, there were protests outside government buildings. In Cairo, a man climbed to the top of a tower and screamed at the sky until police brought him down. Everywhere, the reaction was the same: shock, grief, anger. Humanity had spent over a century reaching out to the stars, dreaming of the day they would join something greater than themselves. That dream had just died. Lisa Morgan was 29 years old when she heard the news. She was a researcher at the New Geneva Space Institute, and she had dedicated her life to the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. She had written papers about what first contact might look like. She had given lectures about the cultural impact of meeting alien life. She had imagined 1,000 different scenarios, but she had never imagined this. She sat in her small apartment and watched Daniel Carter deliver the message. She watched his face crumble. She watched the hope drain out of his eyes, and something inside her changed. She was not sad. She was not scared. She was angry. Who were these aliens to judge humanity? What gave them the right to look down on a species they had never met, never spoken to, never tried to understand? They sat in their distant palaces, surrounded by technology humans could barely imagine, and they decided that Earth was not good enough. They decided that billions of people, with all their dreams and struggles and hopes, were simply not worthy of attention. Lisa stood up and walked to her window. The city stretched out below her, full of lights and movement and life. These were her people. This was her world, and she would not let some distant council decide its fate. The next morning, she submitted a proposal to the Institute. It was simple and ambitious. If the aliens would not share their knowledge, then humans would develop their own. They would build faster ships, better technology, and stronger societies. They would prove that humanity did not need permission to reach the stars. The proposal was rejected at first. The Institute's directors said it was too expensive, too difficult, too unlikely to succeed. But Lisa did not give up. She talked to colleagues. She wrote articles. She gave speeches. Slowly, others began to listen. General Scott Harrison was one of them. He was a military man, hard and practical, and he had no patience for dreams. But he understood something that many others did not. The rejection was not just an insult, it was a warning. If the collective could decide that humanity was unworthy, then they could also decide that humanity was a threat. Earth needed to be ready. He and Lisa met in a small coffee shop near the Institute. They were very different people, but they agreed on one thing: waiting was not an option. 500 years, Scott said, shaking his head. They expect us to just sit here and wait? Then we don't wait, Lisa replied. We build, we grow, we show them that we don't need their approval. Scott looked at her for a long moment. Then he smiled, just a little. I like the way you think. Within a year, the Horizon Initiative was born. It started small, just a handful of scientists and engineers working out of a converted warehouse. People who had lost hope found it again in the idea of building something new. Governments that had been rivals began to cooperate. For the first time in history, humanity was truly united, not by joy, but by defiance. Daniel Carter watched all of this from his office in Geneva. He had resigned as ambassador shortly after the broadcast. There was nothing left for him to do. But as he watched the initiative grow, as he saw the fire in Lisa Morgan's eyes, and the determination in Scott Harrison's stance, he felt something he had not felt in months. Hope. The aliens had rejected humanity. They had promised to return in 500 years and judge them again. But as Daniel looked out at the world, at the lights burning bright against the dark sky, he realized something important.